We're going to go ahead and get started now that we're back on schedule. We'll try to stay on schedule. So I want to thank all of you for coming to this particular presentation today. It's a discussion of something that Ben Rhodes of GSBS Architects and many others at GSBS Architects and Consulting are passionate about, and that's all abilities inclusiveness in all of our work. But we're going to talk particularly about playgrounds today and the importance of all-inclusive playgrounds. As planners, we're motivated to create better communities involving clean environments, affordable housing, open space, accessible transportation, and good educational opportunities. In other words, thinking about how to make our communities healthy, safe, and available for all of its members. Inherent in the concept of local public parks in particular is the idea that all members of a community, regardless of age, race, ethnicity, gender, and ability level, have access to a safe place to gather, play, exercise, and enjoy being outdoors. So Ben's presentation today focuses on making playgrounds accessible to children of all abilities. So Ben is a landscape architect with GSBS. His recent projects include the Weber State University McKay Education Building, in particular the playground at that location, the Japantown Streetscape, the 200 South Streetscape and Landscape, the Salt Lake City Main Library roof. If you've been up there recently, you'll know the work there. And the Price Computer Engineering Building, landscape design up at the University of Utah. He's going to talk for about 30 minutes about this concept and why he's so passionate about this topic, his experiences, and why all abilities playgrounds are important. And then we'll leave plenty of time, about 20-25 minutes, for Q&A at the end. Ben?
Thanks, Christine. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got interested in this. So I grew up in the mountains of Idaho, and my entire childhood I was playing outside. And so, this is some images of my brother and his kids, my niece and nephew, and me up in the mountains skiing. But my entire childhood and my entire adult life was spent playing outside. So we would go hunting, fishing, camping with my parents, and doing so much fun things outside. And that's really what led me to be a landscape architect, because it showed me the values of nature and how to be outside and play and enjoy it. So some of these images are a little pixelated, sorry. But so later in my adult life, I got into rock climbing, and it was pretty much my passion, and that's what I did for about 6 to 8 years of my life, and that's really all I did. I actually got out of the profession of landscape architecture for a while, and I spent a lot of time outside. In 2019, I was in a rock climbing accident and left me paralyzed from the waist down, and that's now why I'm in a wheelchair. And it showed me a different perspective of the world. And in some ways, it really, really scared me, because I was like, how am I going to be able to get outside? How am I going to be able to play? And how am I going to continue to be healthy and live a healthy lifestyle? So thankfully, there's a lot of adaptive programs around Salt Lake Valley. There's 4 of them, and I was able to find ways to stay outside and stay active. And I found my really true passion outside of work is skiing. So I monoski all the time. I've also been able to learn to wakeboard outside, and I've also been able to learn to mountain bike outside. And so without having this available to me and the learning process and that growth process to understand what play looks like for me, my life would be drastically different. So how I really started to think about this is I'm an adult, and I know what the process was for me to go through that with being injured as an adult. But what about kids that are born with a certain condition, or kids that have an accident early on in their life, and how do they play? So I started to think about that a little bit, and so I then started to do the research a little bit. And so what I came to understand is I was looking at all these, I'll use the quotes like all abilities, because you'll understand why I say that. But a lot of these playgrounds really focus on the physical attribute of play. And I'll give an example, some examples of why that is, but that's how I want to frame the discussion today. In the terms all abilities, it can be so much more, and we're going to lend that into inclusive playground design and what does that mean and what does that look like. So first of all, a lot of the playgrounds that I first started to look at when I was looking at this, it's like, yeah, we just opened an All Abilities Park here, we opened an All Abilities Playground here, and then I would go and look at them and see what was going on. And it, like I mentioned, it was purely focused on the physical aspect. So here you have a merry-go-round where a wheelchair can access it and someone can sit on there with a friend and play. But these are just one small portion of the playground. And these are all great ideas. These are all a great place to start. And this is where everything has started so far. The other image here shows a piece of musical equipment and that a wheelchair can pull up underneath and then play with musical equipment with their friends. So we're starting to understand what this looks like, and we're starting to develop this and create these opportunities for kids to play outside. The other thing that I started to notice is a lot of these playgrounds would have a big play feature in the middle of them, and they would provide a ramp up the center of that for all kids to access the whole playground, which is great. But the more and more I dug into this, there wasn't much else for them to do. And so you could get to the top of the play structure, but what are you going to do when you're at the top of the play structure? You can't really play with your friends. You can't build social connections with other kids. More often than not, you're just going up and down this play structure. And I actually talked to a mom in the community. She has an 8-year-old son that is in a power wheelchair, and it scares her because her son just cruises up and down this thing as fast as he can, and that's the form of play for him, because there's nothing really else in the playground for him to do. And then these are just a couple other examples of how physical pieces of equipment can be used in playgrounds, and it provides the opportunity for a person in a wheelchair or a mobility device to use the playground, but it's in a certain area. So I began looking at this, and it's like, well, how can we do more? What does that look like? So the next thing that I want to talk a little bit about here is some other issues that I'm starting to notice as I go to these playgrounds. And the first thing that's really important if you want to provide access for everybody is the surfacing. And so these are a couple pictures of playgrounds throughout the valley. And I don't know how this is still part of ADA code or accessible code, but wood chips are considered accessible for playgrounds. And I mean, I'll let you guys be the judge of these pictures, but how is a kid, on the left-hand image there's a transfer platform. So there's a platform for a kid to be able to transfer onto the play equipment from a wheelchair or a walker or a mobility device. But how is that kid supposed to get their wheelchair or walker or mobility device to that transfer platform when they have to push through, all this surface that can move around and build up in different areas? And then the image on the right, it's kind of hard to see in the shadows here, but this is a swing, and underneath the swing, it's just buried out from kids kicking it all over the place. And so if a kid in a wheelchair or a walker wants to come out and sit on that swing and swing with their friends, now they have 30, 32 inches of height that they have to transfer to get to that swing, and they really can't do it very easily. So I know it's expensive, and this is what I always recommend to people, and I've recommended to a lot of clients. It's 10 times the cost of bark mulch, but poured in place rubberized surfacing is accessible for everybody. And I think thinking about this, we really got to start to think about things like this at the start of projects and fund things like this at the start of projects, because Christine mentioned a project I just did up at Weber State, and they weren't able to fund this. It's a pretty inclusive playground design other than the playground areas where we had to put wood chips in. But had we had the funding to do this, it could have been so much more. So that's the other thing I want as part. These are both sort of physical aspects of play and ways that we can think about doing things a little bit better. So from there, I want to get into what what does inclusive play really look like? And what should we be considering? And what is the population? What is the need for inclusive play? And what does it actually mean? So first of all, when I sort of moved away from the physical play and understood that there was a need for that, but what else is there? So I started to research these different areas of topics. And so obviously the first one's physical play. There's the second one is social emotional. So kids have challenges socially on playgrounds. Then there's the sensory aspect of play. So how do you hit on the senses and how kids play and interact with that? Some people have challenges with vision. Some people have challenges with hearing. And then there's the learning aspect of play, which is the cognitive, how kids communicate on the playground. And then a really big one that I don't think a lot of people really think about is the idea of seclusion. Some kids get overstimulated. And how do you provide something for them? So let's dive into these a little bit more. So if you purely look at the physical aspect and the physical need of kids. So obviously it's wheelchair accessible. Some kids have mobility devices like walkers and crutches and canes and things like that. Another big thing is shade. A lot of kids that are in wheelchairs or have a spinal cord injury can't regulate their own body temperature. So they can only play for a certain amount of time, and then you would need to provide a little bit of shade for them to relax and re-regulate their temperature so that they can play a little bit more. Also providing enclosure, framing things, and then providing ample seating within the playground for kids to relax. So you look at the social aspect of this, and this is really about building a sense of community within kids. How do they build relationships? How are they challenged? And how are they offered being able to succeed in those challenges? And then I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this is sensory play. So touch, smell, sight, and hearing. There's a lot of little things that you wouldn't think about. But for hearing, kids with cochlear implants, like plastic slides, are super problematic for them. Because when they slide down the slide, it's just all static in their ears. Things like this that when I started to read more and more about this stuff, it's like, whoa, that makes sense. So how can we design and start to think about designing a play space for everyone and for all kids? And so then it's on to cognitive play. So this is about social growth, both social growth and individual growth, how kids are stimulated in different ways, how kids interact in different ways, thinking about how kids problem solve and they think differently and how they work together to solve problems. And then communication, this is allowing things like interpretive signage for people to easily find different elements within the playground, audiovisual stuff, the use of Braille, allowing different opportunities for kids to communicate with each other. And then I hit on this a little bit, but this is providing quiet spaces for kids that get overstimulated. They have sensory processing issues where they can't really process a lot of color and a lot of things at the same time. So providing areas within playgrounds that have a sense of seclusion or small areas of respite for kids. So from there, I started to look at different playgrounds that have recently been implemented throughout the United States. And this example here is in Burlington, Vermont. It was done, I believe, 3 years ago. And really what they did here is you can see the poured-in-place rubberized surfacing. So the access to this playground is done really well. You can see all the ramps and the circulation on the left image there. So they're really hitting on that physical aspect of playing, allowing access for all. The other thing is they provided a really nice musical garden or musical space for kids to play, which helps kids stimulate their senses. But what this is doing is only really hitting on 2 of the aspects of what I just covered. And so I began to notice a pattern in this, and this is another example of a playground in Portland, Oregon, where the whole surface is accessible. And it's got a lot of different colors, it's got a lot of different play equipment, it's got a lot of different equipment that is accessible. And the thing that it does well is it has areas of seclusion. So the image on the right shows small areas where kids can go and play off on their own, kids that get overstimulated, things like that. But again, it wasn't hitting on much more than that. This is what was available online. I'm not sure exactly what all these pieces of play equipment are, but maybe they are hitting on some of the other aspects that I just talked about. And then this is probably the best example that I found online. This is a new park in Wisconsin. And the really cool thing that happened here is the landscape architect worked with the grade of the site and created a lot of different interesting opportunities for play here that are fully accessible. So it's trying to create a space that's welcoming to all, use the natural features of the site, and really work through all the different elements of play. So it's starting to get there, and it's starting to head in the right direction beyond looking at just what people standardly think of as an all abilities playground, and thinking beyond that a little bit more. But so from all this, I started to develop this diagram. And what this diagram really shows is the 6 categories that I just talked about. And I separated some of them out a little bit so you could kind of see what that looks like. But it really breaks those categories into 8 different areas. And then what are those 8 different areas? And what are the things that you're trying to do in those 8 different areas? And how does that really start to apply to a playground? So, I mean, if you looked at all of this and applied it to a site, this would be a huge site. There would be so many different elements of play on there, and it would be really, really a great place. And I'm not really aware of anything that really hits on all of these. But for example, you look at mobility. What is that? That's about coordination, fine motor skills, and gross motor skills. And then you're talking about climbing obstacles, talking about large play structures, different ways for kids to really engage with that. And then you look at social. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's about community building, taking turns, collaboration, compromise, and growth. So providing areas for group play, areas where kids can just jump in as they want to play, and then if they want to just kind of be off on their own, they can. Different social elements, things like that. So now I want to ask a question to everybody. And what do you think, out of 100 kids, what do you think, how many kids have a physical disability out of 100 kids from a national demographic? Does anyone have a guess? It's less than 1%, 0.07%. And so the next thing after I started to look at, okay, what all needs to go in a playground to make it inclusive? Like, what are the demographics? And how do we start to break that up? How much of that playground should be geared towards intellectual play or communication-based play? And so what this diagram really shows is, based on national statistics, out of 100 kids, 46 kids will have some sort of intellectual disability. And then 18 for communication-based, social-emotional would be 16. And then health-related, that's the shade, the seating, things like that. So really what this started to do is it broke it down in a different way. And as a designer, I hadn't really thought about this until I looked at this. So looking at the demographics of your city or your area can really start to inform what you would need to do for an inclusive playground. So beyond that, I was like, okay, well, here's the statistics. Now, how do we begin to start to apply this? And so what we did is we took a hypothetical scenario and looked at 25,000 square feet and made up a play area. And I said, okay, well, if I'm going to design a new playground that's 25,000 square feet, what equipment do I put there? And how do I meet the best need for an inclusive playground design? And so we rounded some of these off to make them fit. But actually what we did, and I'll show you here in a minute, is we laid out 2 different concepts of what you can do with a 25,000 square foot play area, and then what sort of equipment would apply to that. So based on intellectual, we sort of said 40% or 10,000 square feet is going to be dedicated to that. 3,750 square feet would be dedicated to communication and social emotional, and then 10% for the rest. And so from there, what we did is we went and researched all the play equipment out there that would meet those needs. And then we laid those out in these different scenarios to see how the interactions happen and how you could create and design a couple different ways to build an inclusive playground. So here's just a few examples of what like an intellectual play could be. It could be a climber, some sensory panels, musical equipment, and then communication and other elements here. So from there, that's like, okay, so now this is a 25,000 square foot area. How do we begin to lay that out? And how do we begin to look at how this all comes together? So this is all hypothetical, but when you start to lay this out, we have a sensory garden to the south. And so now you're dedicating a certain area of this playground to that need. From there, you start to layer on the other areas. So like this area becomes the intellectual area, and then you lay on the social connection, lay on health-related elements with shade throughout the playground, areas for communication, and then really what that diagram is trying to show, the diagram I showed a couple of slides ago, is how do you create a space in the middle of this playground where all kids can go and be included and play together. And so what this is really showing is that the whole playground is accessible by all. It's all rubberized surfacing, but there's a core of the playground where it allows every single kid to have a social environment. And that's where the majority of the physical activity happens, but it also provides areas throughout the playground where kids can go off on their own and do their own thing. So that's the first concept that we looked at. The second concept is really similar. It's just another way to start to think about this and how you lay this out. So it's all about the layering of this and how these relationships work, what needs to go next to each other, and how you sort of layer everything on. And the interesting thing that this one is showing is I begin to find that like a lot of people think that flat playgrounds are probably the best for people with mobility issues or different things going on. And it's also kids are kids and they like things that are different. And they like things that have grade change. They run up things, they run down things, they climb all over things. So like that example I showed with all the grade, you can have awesome playgrounds with grade change that are really inclusive of everybody and provide access to all. And you don't have to have just a play structure in the center of the playground with a ramp in it. If you really start to integrate that within the design of the playground, it starts to come together. So that's really what I wanted to share today, but I wanted to talk to everybody and open it up for questions and discussion.
So then I'm gonna take leader's privilege and ask the first question, and that has to do with the relationship of how this approach to playground design interacts with the requirements of, say, ADA, because in a lot of cases, especially when budgets are in play, it becomes a trade-off. What am I required to do? How far can we go, and things like that. And can you talk a little bit about how this approach is different or moves on from other types of requirements for spaces for people?
Yeah, so I mean, all playground features and all playground equipment has different requirements to install that. And what this approach really looks at is beyond the code and beyond what's required for access. How do you look at including things for most everybody? And the idea with this is it's I know it always comes down to funding sometimes, and you can't afford to do certain things on projects because of certain budgets. But if you have this structure, you can start to think about the benefits to all these kids, and maybe you can layer on another aspect of that that serves a different need of different child. It's kind of the idea behind all of this.
Sorry.
Thank you, first of all, for doing this excellent presentation. My name is Divya Chandrasekhar. I am with the Youth Urban Planning Club, but more importantly, I am the mother of a child with cerebral palsy and severe autism. And so I think it's fair to say we never go to a playground. We just don't have any that we can safely go to and enjoy. So thank you, first of all, for addressing this very important issue. I have sort of follow up to the ADA requirement, but also based on your previous examples that you showed of arts around, I'm wondering what you think is the recipe to getting something like this implemented. Is it residents that we have to, rally? Is it planning commissions we have to rally? Apart from the budget question, what other process things would you recommend?
I think it kind of starts at two different levels. And I think the first level, and since this is the APA conference, talking to planners, and as planners start to put together plans for cities and how they're allocating space, I wanted to kind of change the mindset of it's not an all abilities playground, it's an inclusive playground. And we need to think about the demographics of your community. And you need to start to think about allocating that space. And then along with that, which is the second part of how I was going to answer your question, is the funding for that. And I realized that, I mean, if I had all the money in the world, like it would be it's a huge need out there. I've talked to so many parents that are just like you, that don't have a place for their child to play. And if we had all the money in the world, it'd be great to hit on all of these needs and have the funding to hit on all of these needs. But the reality is, how can you learn more about these other needs of kids? And if you only have so much, how do you start to layer that on just a little bit more each time? Because what we've started here is with the 1%, they're less than 1%, which is the physical disability. And 46% of the population, or the other 99% of the population, isn't being served in the right way.
I have a few comments and then a question. First of all, impressive presentation. You should take this to a national APA conference if you have the opportunity. The design concepts that you have here for play spaces, they rock. They're much better than what I'm seeing being built, right? Typically in our communities. Obviously, you mentioned earlier the gap between funding. I was just quickly trying to look up grant sources that may fill that void. I'm sure dollars are always very limited and competitive. Is that something that can reasonably be grown? Is that an opportunity to try and fill that need? Because as Christine mentioned, more than ever, city budgets are getting tighter and tighter with increasing costs. Herman, where I work, we've had to really scale back our budget. Our appetite for what we think we want in our markets versus what we can actually build is rapidly, the chasm between those two is rapidly growing. So anyway, again, great presentation. Love to see a way of trying to address that gap in financing.
Yeah, so I have looked at the grants a little bit, and basically what I found is they're very small. So some playground manufacturers will give you, I think Landscape Forms has a $10,000 grant that you can apply for. But, that's, 10% of what I outlined for a 25,000 square foot playground. So they're really small, and there's a need out there for it. And I would love to see larger grants being available for things like this throughout the country.
Can I just, sorry, I just wanted to add that one possible approach would be when you design an all-inclusive playground, to think about phasing it as funding becomes available over time. The way that Ben has laid out the concepts, you can see it will allow you to sort of, as long as you have the big picture in mind, allow you to sort of phase that in a way that you can start to address some of those needs over time. I mean, it's hard to do all these things all up front. It would be great if we could always do that, but and I think as the conversation grows and we start to draw more attention to the need for this, then existing funding grant providers like the Project for Public Spaces and things like that, hopefully that will start to follow as well. Sorry.
I love all the different ideas about, you know, the different pieces we're looking at. I'm curious, I've been reading the Anxious Generation book, trying to get kids off screen-based childhood to a play-based childhood, and a lot of the concepts they're talking about in that book is needing more unstructured play and unstructured play areas, more open spaces for kids to go back to like our 90s childhood when we played tag. So just curious on the unstructured play piece, if that's something you looked into, and kind of creating these areas for creativity, exploration, trying to get these kiddos to play without some structured features.
Yeah, scroll back here, but on the first concept, there's an area of nature play, which is kind of defined in the upper right hand side there, and really that's part of what this is. And the idea is that it's like it's accessible to everybody, but maybe in the nature play area, you let kids play as they are. And the playground that we just did at Weber State at the grand opening is actually right now. And it's happening. So, but the whole concept of that was unstructured nature play. And so that's another aspect. And it was actually kind of cool. Our graphic designer designed these really cool boxes on that playground where they could store insects. And I was just like up there and just watching these kids run around and like grab different flowers and insects and like preserve them. I mean, it's a little bit structured, but nature play is such an interesting aspect of that you could kind of just let kids do what they want.
I'm trying to make sense and not ramble too much here, but I'm not a really experienced playground designer. I work in landscape architecture and in planning, but it seems like, and this is just my perception, a lot of times our code, not only with playgrounds, but with buildings and public spaces, but more specifically with playgrounds, can get maybe in the way of good open-ended and nature play specifically, but also even our fall zone restrictions sometimes make it tougher to use existing trees and have shade in a playground and things like that. And that those restrictions and requirements can be a major driver for the increasing cost for doing any type of playground. And so you mentioned earlier the wood chips and how those probably shouldn't be included as an accessible surface in the code. So a piece continuing from that, it seems like the ticket to some better outcomes would be advocacy for overhauling the codes and reforming them. I'm just curious if you've looked at, are there different countries or different parts of the world where you've seen some exemplary balance there between code and design and being free with design and intended functions.
Yeah, I mean, the only place I can think of is Canada. And I actually went up there to get my new adaptive bike. But my friend up there, who's also in a wheelchair, she showed me, I can't recall the name of the program they have up there, but essentially what it is a program that builds all these accessible playgrounds all over Canada, and it's government funded. I'll try and look up the name of that and remember it, but they don't really have a lot of code background to like inhibit that. So that's one area that I've looked at, and the thing about the playgrounds that I saw there is they were still relatively flat, but all of the equipment was accessible and all the equipment was inclusive. And I don't know where the funding of where the design ideas came from that or the code implications of that, but it seemed like it was more sort of wide open.
Ben, is it the Enabling Accessibility Fund? And it's $200,000 for small projects?
No,
For
it's
Canada?
they're all red. That's what I remember. The whole surfacing of them are all red. It's called like I think it's like Jump Start Canada or something like that. I'll text my friend Liz. Yeah.
At least you fell up the stairs, right? How does this kind of design and playground equipment compare with, for lack of a better term, regular or more traditional playground equipment? Obviously, wood chips cost more than the higher end fall surfaces and things. But just in general, is there a big expense difference between this kind of thing and the more traditional?
No, I mean not that I've seen. And so like the idea is the equipment and all kids can use that piece of equipment. It's not just specialized for one need. And it's allowing kids to be able to play together no matter what their needs are. And you know that the slide where I showed all the cost of sort of laying that out, that's pretty comparable to you know your standard playground feature that you see at any park. It's just the size of that, right? And I think the idea here is that it's more smaller pieces of equipment scattered throughout the playground rather than one large piece of equipment in the center. And that large piece of equipment in the center is probably where you get most of the cost for that, the playground equipment. All right. I'm sure we have a lot of time. Oh, yeah.
Go back to your research page.
Oh,
This one here?
That's one, I think. Where you had the dots on the right hand side and you showed the percentages.
Oh, yeah. This one or
That one works, and then the next one too. I thought your research was awesome. And you went out there and you got, oh, you know, that's the original research that you did. Got that one right there.
yeah. I had a very good employee. She's since moved on to Colorado to take a different job, but she was as passionate about this as I was. So we dove into this pretty heavily.
So what has your experience been with what we're seeing with a lot of,
Vern.
yes. What have your experience been with a lot of kids these days? My wife works with special needs, so autistic, Down syndrome, other disabilities that how would the playground design change to accommodate them as well? They don't necessarily have a physical disability.
it gets back to that sort of intellectual stimulation and looking at what that is for them. What does that look like? And then researching and finding that play equipment to provide for them. A really interesting conversation I had with this mother, I think it was 2 years ago. She had a 6-year-old autistic son and an 8-year-old son that was in a wheelchair. And she's like, they can't play together. There's nowhere in here for them to play together. Like they can't even really play together at home. So the idea is like, how do you foster and talk to different communities and finding out what the need is in your community to provide that, understand what that play equipment is to stimulate a kid with autistic needs to be able to play with any kid that they feel comfortable playing with.
I should let you do it because I'm old.
Like, you know, we've spoken about community parks, but there's actually schools, and schools have playgrounds. And to be honest, schools do not have inclusive playgrounds either. I'm wondering if your research or your designs could also be adapted, because school districts do have funding for playground equipment, and they have mandate from the idea, the Disability Act, to provide inclusive spaces. And so perhaps the lower hanging fruit might be talking to school districts and at least starting there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could adapt this to whatever environment that the playground is in. And I talked to a school district last year, and they were starting there. They had a small piece of land, I think it was 2,000 square feet, and they're like, "What can we do with this?" And they were installing 3 pieces of physically based play equipment, and it's a good place to start. And I think it's just about having those conversations more and more with these different entities to really change the mindset and hopefully change the funding to be able to meet the need of more kids.
I work for a rather large city. We have our own Parks and Recreation Department. And I want to let you know personally that I'll be sharing this information with them. And I think as planners, we come to conferences, and that's what we love about planning. It's so diverse, right? We can do everything from transportation playground equipment to subdivisions to whatever else, the big site plans. So I really appreciate that. We'll share that, but as they have their own parks and different conferences, have you presented at other conferences kind of specific to Parks and Rec?
I haven't, but I was in Vermont. I have good friends out there that I mountain bike with, and I actually attended a Vermont Parks and Rec conference, and I thought about it, like, hey, I should talk about this stuff with some of these people. But
Hi, I'm Amanda Roman. I work for Salt Lake. I'm in the planning division in urban design. And my family's a Penser, the ADA community. I just had a baby 6 months ago, and she surprised us with dwarfism. And so this has been really helpful, and I really appreciate it and love to connect more. Salt Lake right now, we're really focusing on bringing families downtown, back downtown, and creating family-sized units, creating places for children, since there's a lot of children downtown. And there's some projects that we're working on right now. I think this could be very much implemented because they're in the beginning stages. So I think that's really nice.
yeah, great.
Did an excellent job. I really appreciate the information. I was wondering, you showed one project where you said the designer had used the slope. At what point does the slope become uninclusive in the playground?
I think it's essentially about reframing how you look at that. Because if you look at code for a wheelchair, for somebody to access it in a wheelchair, that's 1 in 12, right? And but what that is about is it's about providing areas for kids to challenge themselves. And so you think about a kid in a walker, maybe they can barely move their legs at all, and it's really challenging for them to walk, or they walk with crutches. But if you provide a gentle slope for them to kind of begin to attempt to run with their friends, and then that is all on a spectrum, right? And then maybe you have a kid that has a very, very limited mobility challenge. So if you provide a steeper slope for them to climb up things with their friends that maybe don't have that challenge, it's all about providing that for everybody, essentially. But I think framing it is like it's never going to be wheelchair accessible, but you don't necessarily always have to have every area of the playground be wheelchair accessible, because that is sort of that 1% that I talked about, whereas 99% want to use a steep slope. And there's just different disabilities out there that can be encouraged to use these steep slopes or steeper slopes.
Right. So it's been a great conversation. And one of the things that I keep thinking about is that this is a conversation that we need to continue to have in our communities. We all know that in our cities, parks need to be updated on a regular basis. It has a useful life, so they get in the schedule for replacement in the capital improvements program. And as that happens, thinking about how to transition some of those areas to more inclusive approaches, it would be another way to do this incrementally, just thinking through how we start to make this happen within our own communities. And as I look at those spaces, they're really fun for all kids. I mentioned the new roof at the Salt Lake City Main Library. And there is an area there for kids to play. And we had an event there, a firm event there the other day, and some of the people brought their children and they went crazy. But it was an accessible area. And so they're great for all kids, right? So they're a lot of fun. And they're, from my perspective, a little more interesting than the playgrounds my kids grew up on. So, any other questions or comments? I want to thank you all for a great conversation, and thank you, Ben, for all this hard work. So,
thank you.